First of all, thank you, Mr. Thomas, for your time today. It is a great personal opportunity for me, and on behalf of the Rocket City Civil Rights Organization, we all thank you. I'd like to start with you in your childhood in St. Augustine, Florida. If you could, tell me a little bit about your schooling situation growing up in St. Augustine.
St. Augustine is a southern city and was segregated, but a little bit different from your typical southern city. While the schools were segregated, the neighborhoods were not necessarily segregated. You'd have whites living on one side of a street and blacks living on the other, or whites living at one end of the street and blacks living at the other. And we, as children, probably up until the age of 9 or 10, had white playmates. And it seems that at a certain age, all of that changed. Um, I cannot remember in St. Augustine any kind of racial violence. I think the attitude of whites in St. Augustine was not so much antagonistic, but more or less paternalistic toward blacks. And later I learned that as an adult, they would say everybody knew their places, and so you had no problems. I early on knew that the separation of races, there was something wrong with that because white folks always lived better than black people. And I used to question that. I questioned that when we lived in Georgia. And that's a question that a parent of a black child does not like to hear when you ask, why do white people live better than we live, and this type of thing? Or why do you have to say yes, sir, and no, sir, to white people? My first encounter in St. Augustine with this not giving black women honorific titles of Miss or Mrs. occurred with the insurance man. The insurance man was always white, and he came to the house to collect for the insurance premium. And I remember I'm sitting on the porch one day, and the insurance man comes up and said, "Is Rebecca home?" And I said, "There's no Rebecca here, but there's a Mrs. Williams here." And he said, "Well, that's who I come to see, Rebecca." I said, "That's Mrs. Williams." And I insisted on that, or else he was not coming in. I don't know what my aunt was thinking about that, but later on, I understand she was very proud of me. We had a bus service there. The city bus service may have consisted of 6 buses. I never went to the back of the bus. I always sat near the front. The other thing that I remembered, and they remember me about in St. Augustine, is there were 2 libraries, one for whites and one in the black community in the back of a convenience store. That was the library for blacks. I decided that the books in the black library were not adequate enough. I've always been a voracious reader. I went downtown to the white library to get a book, take out a book, and of course the librarian said, "We don't let Negroes take out books." And I wanted to know why. Of course I knew why, but I questioned her why. The next day I came, and again I was refused permission to check out a book. On the 3rd day, I brought my own books, and I sat right there in the front reading my books, or at least pretending to read my books. And many whites would pass me and just look at me and keep going. And this one woman wanted to know from the librarian, why is he sitting there? She said, "Oh, that's just Henry." And she wanted to know, well, what is he doing there? She said, "Well, he brought his books to read." And she wanted me out. But the librarian said, "He's not doing anything but reading. So that was my one little victory. The other victory was the Civilian Air Patrol. You had the white Civilian Air Patrol where you had teenagers would volunteer. This is during the 50s, and I guess we were expecting the Russians to fly over bombers any day now. So you had teenagers with a chart of the Russian aircrafts and a pair of binoculars to look at each aircraft and decide that if it's friendly or not. Well, I went down to apply for that, and they had never had a Negro to apply to be a cadet patrolman. So they gave me a cap, binoculars, and we were on the bridge in St. Augustine. The bridge is still there today, called the Bridge of Lions. And there were two houses there for the people who operate the bridges. Well, they had the white kids in one bridge and me in the other, right across from each other. And I did my job, never did find any Russian aircraft, but these were the things that I would do in St. Augustine.
So from St. Augustine, you said you went to Georgia, and then from Georgia you went to Howard University, is that correct?
I went to Howard from St. Augustine, yeah.
Okay. While at Howard, were you exposed to any activism, anything like kind of, I mean, it sounded like at an early age you already had that fire within you, but is there anything that happened there that kind of, sparked it even further?
No, I knew Howard was a top school academically. We used to say Howard was black folks' Harvard. That's where the best and doctors and lawyers and professional people sent their kids. And but initially, I mentioned going to the University of Florida. That's way before any blacks ever attended there. And some of the people that I worked for always had an extra job after school. And I told them where I wanted to go to school. And some of them were somewhat shocked for being paternalistic. They said, why don't you just go to one of the schools where you have lots of other Negroes? If you go to University of Florida, and also University of Wisconsin was one of the schools that I was interested in, say, you're not going to be comfortable there, and so forth. And later on, I'm learning that the idea of a white person encouraging me to go to a predominantly white school was just simply out of the question. So I wound up going to Howard University. Initially, I played football in high school and had an offer for several schools to play football, but I chose Howard University. And it was a cultural shock for me at Howard, because here I am, all of these kids whose parents were professional people, teachers or doctors or lawyers, and I was not to the manner born. When I got to Washington, I got there 2 weeks ahead of time because I knew I needed to get a job in order to help pay for my expenses. And surely enough, I did get a job once I got to Washington, D.C. I got a job within the second day that I was there. Time for me to go to the campus and to be registered. So I'm standing in line with all of the other kids, and I'm trying hard not to let anybody know that I'm a hick from the sticks, so to speak. And I was always spoke very well with no particular Southern accent or anything like that. So I'm having a conversation with my colleagues as we're standing in line to pay our fees. And I finally get up to the door and into the registrar's office, and you go to the desk, and the young lady will tell you what your school fees are, what your tuition and board is. So she told me how much it was. I don't remember the figure, but I said to her, I need to talk to the head man. Well, you don't speak that kind of language among the folks who are upper class, so to speak. But I said, let me talk to the head man. And she said, I beg your pardon? I said, I want to talk to the head man. And she looked at me and reluctantly knocked on the door of the chief registrar. And I guess she told him the story, and I could almost hear him laughing. But then he said, send him in. And I went in, and he said, young man, I understand that you came all the way to Washington, D.C. to go to Howard University, and you don't have any money. I said, let's not talk about that. The question is, do you have work that needs to be done around here? And I'll do some work in exchange for you let me go to the classes. He read back in his chair as though to say, I don't believe this. And he agreed. And so the next day I went to work as a janitor in the School of Dentistry, and that's how I paid my way through Howard University. But that was only for tuition and room. I had to eat the best way I could, and I never ate in the cafeteria at Howard. There was always a kid on the floor of my dorm who didn't want to go to breakfast or didn't like breakfast, and I went from to room, finding out who didn't want to eat that day, and they let me use their card. So that's how I lost a lot of weight during that first year, but that's
Real quick, tell me about your roommate, John Moody. That was your roommate at Howard?
at Howard.
Was he the one that introduced you to the core organization?
John was, I didn't know it at the time, but he was much older than us. To go on the Freedom Ride, it was required that you must be 21 age or older for obvious reasons. That core could not be charged contributing to the delinquency of a minor. When the 3 days before the training session started with the Quakers, we trained at a facilities that the Quakers had there in the D.C. area. John became ill, I think, with the flu. And then he said, why don't you just go in my place? You know, it's always big for my size, and if I kept my mouth shut, nobody knew exactly how old I was. And so I did, and probably halfway through the training, I don't know how they found out, but they found out that I was only 19 years old. But we're halfway through the training, and it's too late to get somebody else. So they gave me intensive training because of my youth about not fighting back or not having word for word and this type of thing. And that's how I got on the Freedom Ride. And John Moody has never forgiven me for that.
Now, did you have a temper before this training? Were you temperamental?
I had a way of coping with things. We'd have quite a few sit-ins with our group at Howard. The city of Washington had a public accommodations law, but North and Northeast was the state of Maryland, was segregated, and the South was Virginia, and it was segregated. So we would go one weekend over into Maryland, another weekend over into Virginia, sitting in at the lunch counters. Also, we would picket theaters and restaurants. I was never physically attacked because, number one, my size, and then I always had a very mean look on my face. I deliberately did that because I didn't want to be anybody's martyr. So I'm walking a picket line. You may have some guy over there and he's calling out the N-word, and I would look directly at him with nary a smile on my face. And pretty soon, by the time I got abreast of him, he would stop. So I put on a pretty good bluff that I was never physically attacked. And it wasn't until I was on the Freedom Ride that I was attacked. And this was when we had our first stop in Winnsboro, South Carolina. It was my time to get off with Jim Peck and go in. Jim would go into the colored restrooms and I would go into the whites. When we pulled in, Jim was the first person to get off, and as soon as he got off the bus, a group of white toughs attacked him, knocked him down, and was beating him pretty severely. We were taught, you don't interfere, you don't try to protect your friend, because that could be seen as a provocation. So after they pretty much roughed up Jim, it was my time to get off. I put on the best John Wayne impersonation that you ever want to see. I got up slowly. I walked to the front of the bus. I got to the front door, and there were 3 guys down there waiting on me, and they were going to give it to me. I paused and I looked at each one of them. And then all of a sudden, they started to mellow. And I took one step down, and I looked at each one of them. And by the time I got to that second step, they moved aside, and I walked through them. And I got inside the restroom, and I said, Whew. It worked. But right then, of course, the police came in and arrested me. And I was happy to be arrested because I didn't know what those guys were coming in with a whole bunch of fellas.
Right.
So they took me to jail, and it was my first encounter with real potential violence. They put me in jail, didn't say a word to me, didn't say I was arrested, but they put me in the cell block. And I'm asking the question, am I being arrested? Do I have a right to make a phone call and all of this? Nobody would say anything to me. After a couple of hours of this, now it's getting dark. And my imagination is working overtime. White cops taking a colored guy out in the middle of the night, and he's never heard from again. They came to get me out of the cell. And I said, where are you taking me? They said, you wanted to leave? We're going to take you to the bus station so you could leave. 3 police officers, 2 in the front and 1 in the back seat with me. I'm talking to keep from sounding like I'm nervous. And I ask again, where are you taking me? Well, they turn a couple of corners and I could see the bus station and a crowd of about 15, 16 white guys there. The lights in the bus station were out. They stopped about a block away from the bus station. And he told me, the driver said, there's the bus station, you can go. And I said, you can't put me out here. You know, those guys probably gonna do harm to me. The guy in the back seat put his hand on his gun and said, get out or I'm gonna blow your damn brains out. Well, it didn't take me long to make up my mind. I got out of the car and they took off, burning rubber. And the guys started running toward me, yelling and screaming. I'm still in good physical shape in terms of running, so I believe I could outrun them. But where am I going to run to? I knew nothing about the town, and so I just started running, not knowing where I'm going to run to. And I think I'm putting distance between them. And by this time, a black man drives up in a car, running, the car driving alongside me, and he said, son, get in the back seat and get down on the floor and don't get up. And of course I did, and that's how I got out of Winnsboro. While I'm on the floor, I'm expecting to see the bullets or the glass shadow in the back. But that's how I got out of Winnsboro, and he drove me to Columbia, South Carolina. The story is I never knew the man's name. Turned out when I did find out who he was a minister from Rock Hill. Rock Hill was about 30, 40 miles from Winnsboro. He was president of the NAACP. He had heard that the Freedom Riders were coming through both Rock Hill and Winnsboro. And he was serving as the lookout man for the NAACP. Well, when I found out his name, maybe some 15 years later, I kept saying, I've got to go back there to meet him and to thank him. On the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides, the people of Rock Hill invited me to Rock Hill because they were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Rock Hill 9. And I told that story to a packed church audience about the man who rescued me. This is where it gets a little emotional. I told them about that minister who rescued me, and I said, I never got the chance to thank him. A lady in the back of the church stood up and said, that man was my father. And we just ran to each other and hugged each other. And then I learned that her father had died that November. He was a paraplegic from World War II, decorated soldier from World War II. He had fallen off of his roof. He was a man that did not let his disabilities get in the way. And of course, he'd been cautioned time and time again about some of the things he was doing, but he fell off of his roof, and that subsequently killed him. And I kept in touch with her for a long time. But that was a very, very brave man. Now imagine, I don't know what they would have done to him had they caught him. Now, he was paralyzed from the waist down and a World War II veteran, but he apparently knew no fear after
He probably
having.
knew more of what could possibly happen to both of y'all than you did at that
Yeah,
point.
that is right. That is right. And so I came on to Atlanta because the rest of the group had come to Atlanta. Dr. Martin Luther King had warned us not to go into Alabama, and especially Anniston, Alabama. That was going to be our first stop in Alabama. Anniston was known for being a hotbed of the Klan. Well, having had my encounter with the Klan, I was not that enthusiastic about stopping in Anniston anyway, but I tried to be cool. And so we left Atlanta, and on our way into Anniston, maybe about 30, 40 miles outside of Anniston, a Greyhound bus coming from Anniston waved down our bus, and the two drivers got out and talked to each other. And we learned that the driver coming from Anniston was warning the bus driver that a mob was waiting for us at the bus station. And when the bus driver got back on, he just looked at us. I can't say whether he had a smirk on his face or what have you, but he probably also knew that he would be in danger. As soon as we got into the city limits of Anniston, the streets were cleared. This is on a Sunday, Mother's Day. No one was on the streets. Up until that time, we were having conversations with each other and maybe a little bit of singing. But once we got into Anniston, all of that stopped because we knew that this was the real deal and that we could really be in trouble. As we pulled onto the street where the bus station was, we saw the crowd. Men, and as we got closer, we could see some of the weapons that they had. Sticks, baseball bats, iron pipes, what have you. And they started yelling and screaming when the bus pulled in. Well, when the bus pulled in, they immediately crowded the bus, trying to get onto the bus. I thank the bus driver because what he did was, when he got off, he locked the door so the people on the outside could not get in. And I remember him saying, "Hey, fellas, I just drive the bus, that's all." And he went inside, I guess, to safety. Well, they started beating on the bus, rocking the bus. They started breaking out the windows of the bus. I'll never forget, my seatmate was the late Ed Blankenheim. And Ed said, "Hank, we need to get out and make a report, see if this bus station restrooms are segregated." I said, "Ed, take my word for it. It's segregated." He said, "No, but we got to get out." I said, "Ed, we'll get killed getting out there." So Ed was convinced that getting off the bus at that point was not a good idea. Half the windows had been broken out, and luckily for us, they had the shatterproof glass, so all they could do is just break the windows. All of this time, telephone conversations are going on between the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and Governor Patterson. And Robert Kennedy is saying, "You got to make sure those Freedom Riders are protected." And I think Governor Patterson is saying agitators won't be protected, or I can't protect the food. That's what he said. And more calls were made saying that if you don't get those Freedom Riders out of there, they are really going to kill them. They almost turned over the bus, and they were rocking that bus. Finally, the Greyhound Company did get a driver who would agree to drive the bus out of Anniston. And he got on the bus, and he tried to drive out, and there were about 3 or 4 pickup trucks in front of the bus. Men were laying down or sitting down in front of the bus, not letting the bus move. So he drove slowly, and He began to leave the bus station, and we looked out at the back of the bus, and there was 4 or 5 cars behind the bus. The bus could not travel any more than about 15 miles an hour. We did not know at that time that the bus tires had been slashed. Now, you know how large a bus tire is, so you can only imagine what kind of device they used to slash those tires. So after a few minutes, the tires went flat. And they went flat by coincidence right in front of a country store. And in front of that store was a large crowd of people, some of whom just come from church. I don't know whether it was a coincidence or somehow planned, but it must have been a coincidence because they had no way of knowing when the bus tires were going to go flat. And when it did, the rest of the windows from the bus was broken out. Again, the bus driver got off fearing for his life, but at the same time, he locked the doors. Well, we couldn't go anyplace. All of the windows were being broken out. At that point, shortly thereafter, an incendiary device was thrown aboard the bus from out of through one of the broken windows. And immediately, the bus started burning in the rear. And the fabric of the upholstery was giving off this black toxic smoke. I knew that if I got off of that bus, I would be beaten to death. If I stayed on the bus, that smoke was going to get me, and I'll never forget Albert Bigelow had said to us, get down on the floor as close to the bottom of the floor as you can. That's the only place you can get some oxygen. Well, that only lasted a couple of minutes. And I took a deep breath of that toxic smoke, thinking that it would put me to sleep, and that's the way I was going to die. Well, you get that smoke in your lungs, your involuntary muscles take over, and you got to get out of there and get some fresh air. So I jumped up, and people outside saw me, and I started going toward the front, and I heard somebody say, they're trying to get out. They're trying to get out. Let's burn them alive. I got to the front, and surely there were 2 men holding the door. So I hit the door with my shoulder. Nothing doing. And probably another few seconds, I would have been completely overcome with the smoke. At that time, the fire had reached the fuel tank in the back of the bus, and it blew out the back of the bus, and everybody on the outside ran, including those men. That's how I got off the bus. That's how we all got off the bus. And but when you get off that bus is fully inflamed now. You got all of the heat from the flame plus the smoke. You got to get as far away from that bus as you can. But the mob would not let us get that far away from the bus. If we moved a little bit from the bus, they would come toward us. There's a picture of me because we had the town had a photographer there who were taking pictures. Man came up to me, I'm just about clear of the smoke, and he said, "Are you all right, boy?" And I'm thinking, here's somebody who's concerned. And when I shook my head, said, "Yes, I saw stars." I was on the ground. He had hit me with something, I guess, like a baseball bat. There's a picture of me on the ground, and I'm getting up. When I got up, 3 guys running toward me. There's a highway patrolman standing there all the time. And I looked at him, and I saw that he wasn't going to do anything. So I made one of the most foolish but best choice that I've ever made. I got behind him, and I held him by his belt. Now, that is normally a death sentence, okay? The patrolman pulled his gun, and I just knew he was going to shoot me. There's a picture of me putting my hand over my face. I don't know why I did that, but I guess I didn't want to be shot in the face. He fired his weapon and said, "All right, y'all had your fun. That's enough now. Back off." And we're still full of smoke in our yard. You're on the ground, you're wretcheding, and all of this, you're still trying to get air in your lungs, and most of all, water. You're trying to get water. And a little 12-year-old girl, Janie Forsythe, was running in and out of her house, bringing us water. And she was using, I guess, little paper cups initially. Then she ran back and got I think it was a bucket full of water, and just giving each one of us water. And I'll never forget when she came to me to give me water, 4 or 5 of those men just looked at her with a scowl on their face. I since named her the Anniston, the Angel of Anniston. Her mother had to send her out of town because the Klan had a meeting. Said, "What are we going to do about little 12-year-old Janie?" I think their store was vandalized a couple of times. I talked with Janie just 3 days ago. She lives in California now. We have that bond that will be forever there. And I asked her, had she and her sister ever reconciled? Because her sister, for a long time, refused to speak with her. But Janie's life had been turned upside down, and she has had more than her share of heartbreaks and heartaches. I wear this cap today because I want people to understand that 2 times the Viet Cong tried to kill me, and 2 times the Klan tried to kill me. On the 20th anniversary of the Freedom Ride, CBS took me back to Anniston. And I did not know at the time that he had found 2 men who were part of that mob, and 2 men who had been indicted but set free. And we came face to face. They didn't know who I was, and I didn't know who they were. And so when Ed Rabel, who was the reporter, introduced us to each other, I extended my hand to shake hands with him. This is 20 years hence. He refused to shake my hand. When I told that story many years ago to a reporter, he said, "Well, let me tell you why." He said, "The Viet Cong wanted to kill you because of the color of your uniform. That man wanted to kill you because of the color of your skin. So you're still dealing with color." And I never did get a chance to meet any of the men in the mob. We came very close one time when Oprah was going to have us on this show. And this man backed out because he was afraid that I was still mad with him and he didn't know what I was going to do. Yeah. Kind of a sorry excuse, but nevertheless.
Sorry,
Yeah.
excuse.
The other reason I wear this cap, and I want people to know that I served my country. Think about it. 2 years after the Klan tried to kill me on the Freedom Ride, I get my draft notice to step forward, raise my right hand, swear to protect the enemies of this country. Black men have always fought a 2-front war. In World War II, my dad was a Marine, and when he came back home in 1946 and he went to Louisville, the county seat of Jefferson County, to register to vote, he put on his uniform with his medals, and the registrar, the white register, said, "No black," he didn't say black, "no N has ever registered in this county, and you ain't gonna be the first one." And my father pointed to the ribbons on his chest, and the register said, "I don't care if you killed Tojo, you ain't gonna vote." I could have won the Congressional Medal of Honor, but I would not have been able to go into a restaurant in downtown Birmingham, Montgomery, or Huntsville. In Aliceville, where the prison camp was for German POWs. The POWs, German POWs, were treated better than the Tuskegee Airmen. Tuskegee Airmen, who flew escort for the bombers of the 15th Air Force, and they never lost a bomber to German fighters. They were one of the highest rated units in World War II. They would not have been able to vote it when they came back. That shame is the shame of America. But right up until the '64 Civil Rights Bill, and even shortly thereafter, I wouldn't have been able to go into a restaurant. I was a medic in Vietnam, and the first soldier that I treated for injuries was a young white boy from Alabama. And most of the soldiers that I treated were white, and the only name they called me was Doc. Thank you, Doc. Thank you. Or when they got hurt or they got shot, they hollered, Doc, Doc. But if any of those soldiers had been from the South, whom I had saved, I would not have been able to go into a restaurant with them. That is the shame of America. It has changed now, but it left its scars on me.
Yes, sir. After your, let's move on to your time in Huntsville. You mentioned Huntsville earlier. After your recovery from the Anniston attacks, it seems that, that during that time period that CORE kind of fanned out across the South and started taking movements to different places. Were you chosen to go to Huntsville, or did you volunteer to go to Huntsville? How did you end up?
I was chosen to go to Huntsville.
You were chosen to go to, okay.
I was to come to Huntsville to get a movement started among the Alabama A&M students. At that time, I don't think they had had a sit-in movement. So I went to the campus and got very good reception from the students. Didn't get such good reception from the administration. I understand now why it was. You know, not the accreditation, but the appropriations for the school was in doubt. You know, John Patterson was making it quite plain that you don't get a handle on those students, then, you know, you're not going to get the appropriation. He had humiliated the president of Alabama State, had him to come before the state legislature and practically beg for the appropriation and promised them that he would deal with those students, and most of the students who led the sit-ins were expelled. So, you know, looking back on that, I can understand why. It was a terrible spot to have these particular presidents in. What I don't understand is the attitude of the president and the officials at Oakwood College. It was not a school that depended on appropriation, but they said I was leading the students astray. The students were known for their obedience, you know, obedience to either the administration or obedience to their parents and to other adults. And here I am leading them astray. So I was told not to come back to the campus. And in both Alabama A&M and Oakwood, the security people were told to make sure I did not come back. So what I had to do was have meetings off campus for the A&M students, and we still got done what we needed to get done in terms of sitting in. I think it was the Woolsworth at that time.
Okay. How was that organization structured as far as, did you make a decision, we're going to target this particular area, or did you kind of leave that up to the students themselves? It seems that they were looking to you for direction initially.
And think about it, I'm only 19 years
Right.
old.
And
they're looking well, I had to act the part, okay. And I think I was the one that chose Woolworth. That was the one that was familiar to me. And there is a photograph of me, and I saw it several years ago. The students would sit in at the lunch counters, And I would come along later on to see how things were going. And I'd walk up and down the aisle behind them, encouraging them and all of this. And I'll never forget one day when I walked into the Woolsworth, and the news reporters were there, and they said, "There he is, there you is." I think I got 2 feet taller from that. But that was my job, because I was told not to get arrested, because if I got arrested, they're going to throw the book at me, and, there goes the movement, so to speak. So, but I enjoyed my time there up until that day. And that day was when some kind of caustic chemical was put on the driver's seat of my car. And it was terrible. And they had to rush me to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, the white doctors wouldn't touch me. And that's when Dr. Herford came in, and he was the one that administered the salve and everything that cooled down the irritation.
My understanding was that you had to sit there quite some time before he was even contacted
That
or
is
even
right.
told that you were there and that you needed help. And you think about the medical Hippocratic oath. And
For them, it was the hypocritic.
yeah, Hippocratic, right, exactly. So one of those Freudian slips.
Yeah.
But were you aware that the next day an incident occurred with that same caustic material in Huntsville?
I think so, but I'm not sure of the details.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of run through that with you. There was a white gentleman named Marshall Keith, who had sat down with some of the students that you had organized, that you were still in the hospital at this point. And he had ordered, of course, it wouldn't serve the students, but he ordered breakfast, and when they went to go get his meal, they came in and sat beside him.
And put the same stuff in.
They started eating, the students started eating his meal. Well, later on that night, he's abducted, pretty much taken out in the woods and doused with that same chemical. And the reason I also want to bring that up is the newspapers would not report the incident with you. And so Dr. Hereford went and got the white doctors and showed them this guy, the white guy, and now they had to report that this was the incident. It was very good. That hypocrisy once again. How long were you in Huntsville?
I don't have a time reference. I think maybe 3-4 months. Yeah.
And do you remember what caused you to have to leave the area?
I think the movement in Huntsville had been organized. The adults had come in and was giving the students some real good direction, and we were always told, if you got stuff started, then step back and let the locals do it. And I think that is what has happened, because I remember 2 of the adults that I worked with. One was Dr. Cashin. The other one was another minister, kind of a short, dark-complected fellow. I don't remember his name, but they got involved, and they were the ones who were then giving the students direction. And I think there was other adults who got involved with picketing of downtown stores and everything.
And in your interaction with police in Huntsville, that may have been different than other areas that you encountered.
I don't remember the police ever being vicious in Huntsville. Now, they certainly weren't vicious with me, no, and not threatening to me either.
Anything else that we'd talked before, and you'd mentioned that Huntsville was basically easy as far as...
It was.
And why, in your opinion, why do you think that was?
I've heard a number of reasons for that.
Start that.
With my question?
No, let him repeat your question.
Okay. Question is, why was Huntsville relatively easy? Easier, certainly, than Montgomery or Birmingham or Anniston. Theory goes that there were a lot of Northerners in Huntsville who was working at the arsenal, Redstone Arsenal there. You had the German scientists there and this type of thing, but a lot of people from other parts of the country other than the South, and people who was accustomed to either working with blacks or eating with blacks. So that's one of the reasons that it wasn't as difficult. And I think the city officials of Huntsville was very conscious of Huntsville's image and didn't want it identified with Birmingham or Montgomery or any of the other violence that occurred in Alabama cities.
Let's go a little bit to after you left Huntsville. If you would want to briefly talk about your trek from that point on.
I went to, I think, Louisville, Kentucky.
After I left Huntsville.
After I left Huntsville, I went to Louisville, Kentucky. And my job there was the same as with Huntsville, to get a core chapter organized and get the local people involved. And I think I was fairly successful at that. I don't think still, well, I think at that time, had I turned 20, I think I had turned 20, but nobody had any idea how young I was.
Right. At 20 years old, you're a civil rights veteran.
Yeah, how about
time.
that?
And then from there, your experience with Vietnam.
Yeah.
Upon ending your military service, if you tell me a little bit about what path you chose, for, I guess, for the rest of your life and so forth.
Hollywood couldn't write a script for what has happened to me. While in the Army, when I got out of the Army, I got married. I came to Atlanta, Georgia. I had visited Atlanta a couple of times while I was in college and became a part of SNCC. And I liked Atlanta, though it was segregated, but you had a vibrant civil rights movement here. So when I came to Atlanta, the first permanent job I got was that of a fireman, Atlanta fireman. And while I was going through the training to be a fireman, I met another Vietnam veteran. We were both training to be firemen. And I'll never forget, while I was in the hospital at Walter Reed, I'm in the ward with all of the other soldiers. And a lot of the white soldiers were talking about the various businesses they were either going to start or they were going back to. Black soldiers were silent. The best we could hope for was to try to get a decent job. That lingered with me. And it so happened that my friend, the late Crowell, had the same similar experience. And he said one day, you know, we ought to go into business. If you're a fireman, your working hours are such that you could actually operate a part-time business. So he said, okay, and I said, okay, what kind of business we're going to go into? And he hit upon the idea of a coin-operated laundry. In those days, apartment buildings did not have connections for washers and dryers. There was always a laundromat in the basement of a particular building. So we said, well, why can't we do something like that? And we knew a couple of black real estate people who handle apartment rentals. We convinced a lady, Miss Lottie Watkins, to let us put 4 washers and 2 dryers in one of her buildings. And the deal was we'd give her 40% of the take for the utilities and the privilege of putting it there, and we take 60%. And that's how we got started, then from one apartment building to another, and we never touched a single quarter. The machines operated on quarters at that time. We never touched a single quarter for 2 years. And we were always saving the money in order to buy another location. And that's how we did it. And then one day, the local television station was doing a story on people who operate unusual businesses. And for whatever reason, they picked us. And they followed us around as we go to our machines and empty out the quarters and everything, and followed us to the bank as we put the money in the bank. And somebody from Burger King, somebody from Dairy Queen saw that. And I guess they were at the point where they would give a black person a franchise. And I was contacted and given a franchise. and operated Dairy Queen for 8 years. And from there, Burger King came calling. We were very successful with the Dairy Queen, very successful with the Burger King. When I look back on it, at the Burger King, I paid myself $160 a week. That's all I would take out of the business, because, I knew that in order for that business to grow, I used to call myself a farmer. And I said, a farmer never ate all of his seeds because he always had to have seed for planting. Operating a Burger King in one of the roughest parts of the city, and that's the way they did it. If they're going to get you in as a black person, they're going to give you the worst piece of property or the worst store to operate. Burger King was surprised that after 2 months, my wife and I were making a profit. And of course, then McDonald's heard about us, and we then sold the Burger King and got McDonald's, and the rest is history. We operated a total of 9 McDonald's and 4 Marriott hotels. We retired, sold all of our McDonald's, and sold 3 of the Marriott hotels. We still have 1 Marriott hotel in Jacksonville, North Carolina. My wife and I have been very, very fortunate. We have provided scholarships, college scholarships. We have put 1 student through medical school, and we have scholarship for 2 right now in Morehouse School of Medicine. Provided scholarships at my alma mater, Howard University, and we've been blessed, and we have passed our blessings on to others. Like I said, my wife tells me when I get a little down in the dumps and blue, she said, "You have nothing to be sad about." And as I look back on it, 7 times somebody has tried to kill me, and I'm still here. I am still here. I remember in one of the ambushes, that first ambush, and you got your face as flat down to the ground as it possibly can be, and you're wishing that you can dig and go down even further. But I remember saying, "Lord, if you get me out of this, I swear I'll make you proud of me." And so I keep remembering that. He got me out of it. And that second ambush, I guess he was saying, "Don't forget your promise now."
Well, I think there's no doubt that the Lord is proud. There's no doubt. And it has absolutely been an honor sitting here speaking with you once again, sir. I would welcome you if you're ever in the area of Huntsville. Please let us know. We'd be more than happy to have you again.
And the porch light is always on for y'all here.
Thank you very much, sir.
Mm-hmm.